The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible by philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Can crowdsourcing catch war criminals? Tonight we'll learn what one organization is doing with an open source approach to the war in Ukraine. Then our Ontario hubs report on why advocates say a living wage is more important than ever in these tough economic times. And from what's driving up food prices to new strong mayor powers, we've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, December 2nd, and that's all ahead on the Agenda. In the fog of war, how is serious wrongdoing, such as atrocities against civilians, tracked, sourced, and reported to the world? An open-source digital investigative group known as Bellingcat came to prominence for their work tracking down Russian assassins and uncovering a massacre in Ethiopia. And now they've put the focus on war-torn Ukraine. One of those right in the thick of it is a Canadian. Giancarlo Fiorella is a senior investigator at Bellingcat, and he joins us now from Amsterdam, Netherlands, for more. Welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
All right, so Bellingcat is the name of the organization. It's in reference to a fable about a group of mice who decide the best way to deal with a murderous cat is to attach a bell to it so it can no longer sneak up on them. Of course, you're not really working with cats and mice here. Can you break it down for us? What is Bellingcat exactly?
Yeah, so Bellingcat is, as you say, based on this philosophy that unfortunately there are lots of cats in the world. They're governments, they are big corporations, they are military groups, and there's also lots of mice. So just ordinary folks like us who had a lot of time, a lot of free time, and were able to put their free time to use in order to discover important things about what these big players were doing. And so Bellingcat is really an organization that works with open source information. That's any type of information that you can freely find on the internet. And what makes it really powerful is that because anyone has access to this data, anyone can contribute to investigations. Anybody can help uncover wrongdoing that these big actors are doing around the world. And so in that sense, I think it's quite revolutionary.
All right, so since 2014, you guys have had quite a few successes in terms of the information and data and work that you've been able to do. Walk me through some of those.
Sure. So one of the earliest investigations that Bellingcat, I think, rose to prominence on was the investigation into the shoot down of MH17. This was a Malaysian airliner's flight that was shot down over eastern Ukraine in 2014, just a few days after Bellingcat was founded, actually. And so the early Bellingcat community, the early Bellingcat researchers, they were able to trace, using information that they were finding on the internet, social media posts, and other data that was online, they were able to trace the equipment, the military piece of equipment that shot down this airplane. And so they were able to determine that it had entered into eastern Ukraine from Russia, that it had in fact fired this missile that shot down the airplane, and then it had sort of snuck back into Russia after that. And again, this was done using information that often the Russian soldiers and the separatist soldiers who were moving this piece of equipment around were taking and sharing online themselves. So that was I think the first big investigation that Bellingcat worked on.
You also did some work in Ethiopia as well. I want to hear about that.
Correct. Yeah. So last year we worked on an investigation that discovered the location of a massacre that had taken place in Ethiopia. And this was based on a set of videos that surfaced on social media, first on an app called Telegram and then on Twitter, that if you watch them, appear to show soldiers executing a group of civilians and throwing their bodies off of a cliff. Now, the claim when these videos first came out was that it had taken place somewhere in Ethiopia, maybe somewhere in a place called Mabere Dago. And at Bellingcat, a big part of the work that we do has to do with verifying videos and pictures, because as you know, there's tons of recycled videos out there that don't really show what people claim to show. So applying the methodology that Bellingcat has helped to develop to verify footage, we were able to determine exactly where this massacre took place, to confirm that it was near a town called Mabere Dago. And based on that, we were able to make other determinations, including the fact that the massacre was likely carried out by the Ethiopian army.
All right, let's do a little deep dive into the actual Bellingcat website and what people can actually see. So we're going to take a look at the work you've been doing around Ukraine for almost a year now. This map allows regular people to record incidences that have led to civilian death and harm during the war in Ukraine and where civilian infrastructure has been destroyed. So thinking about hospitals, schools, apartment buildings, potential war crimes here. So the purple circles here that you see on your map here show where incidences have taken place. The larger purple circles indicate a higher concentration of incidences. I want to zoom in, and we're going to have a look at Kiev here. Tell us what we're looking at, because we have a map here, and then on to the right, we have some images. And this particular incident took place October 10th. Tell us what we're looking at.
So what you're looking at there is a verified incident that took place in Kiev within the course of the wars, the latest chapter of the war that began in February. And so since then, what Bellingcat has been doing alongside a group of volunteers that we have incorporated into our processes and whom we've trained to help us with this is that we're going out onto the internet and we're finding any video, any picture, any visual evidence that shows, as you say, potential war crimes, any harm against civilians or civilian infrastructures. So what we do when we first discover these images is that we archive them so that they don't get deleted and then they sort of disappear forever. And then we verify them. And that means that we determine precisely exactly where they were taken. And once we've done that, we can get a sense for when they were captured. And then based on that, we can analyze them. We can try to determine what kind of munition was used in this particular incident, what was the infrastructure that was hit, if there were any civilian casualties, how many there were. And so all of those points are set on this map for anyone to access and take a look at the devastating effect that the war has had on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine.
Can you give us a sense of the sheer amount of incidences that you and your team have been sent over the last year?
So we have a significant backlog, I think, with over 2,000 individual pieces of evidence at the moment. And so far, I believe we've cleared, that is to say, we've verified approximately, I think it's about 850, 900, not quite 1,000 yet. And that's because the verification process can be quite involved. Again, we want to be 100% sure that those pictures are from Ukraine, that they're from the time that they claim to be from, and we want to know exactly what has happened. So that process can take quite some time, sometimes days or weeks. And so you multiply that for every single piece of evidence that we have, and of course you have a project that can last a long time. So we're talking about thousands of individual pieces of evidence so far.
On that note, you talk about the amount of hours that it takes to go through one image or one video. How can you be sure that these incidences aren't actually real or they're not doctored or staged?
So there's a number of tools that we employ and a number of different techniques that we employ to make sure that that's not the case. So one phenomenon that is quite common when you're working with visual materials online is that an image will be recycled. So for example, you might see a tweet that somebody says, "Hey, I just took this picture this morning. It's in Kiev, and this just happened right now." One simple technique that you can employ is that you can do what's called a reverse image search. So you can essentially try to find where else on the internet does that image exist. And sometimes you find that actually that picture that is supposedly from this morning was taken 3 years ago. And you see that there's an article that references that picture from 3 years ago. So that's one of the steps that we employ to make sure that the images that we're looking at are actually new, that they're recent, that they're from the conflict in Ukraine.
I do have to ask this, even though you are not there witnessing it on the grounds in front of you, I have to imagine seeing this stuff. So much carnage, does it take a toll on you?
Yeah, it does, and this is something that at Bellingcat we take a lot of effort to mitigate, to understand, and that is the effect, the potential negative effect that viewing this content repeatedly has on somebody's mental health. So I've been working on this particular project since February. Since then, I've been working more generally with open source data from conflicts for a number of years. And you're right, there's no comparison to actually being there. But I have felt, and I know that my colleagues have as well, the negative effects of just being constantly exposed to this. So there's a lot of internal processes that we have at Bellingcat. Thankfully, we're supported by our organization. They provide mental health services that we can rely on if we feel like we need them.
All right, I want to change gears a little bit. We've figured out how we get these videos, how you guys archive them, and how you're able to track them back to, who did it and where it is. I want to see, how can we use this in court, or what can actually happen here? What are the chances that these hundreds of videos and pictures of civilians' death can actually be admissible in a court of law? Take, for example, the International Criminal Court.
I think the chances are quite high. The International Criminal Court in particular, as well as other courts around the world, they have increasingly signaled that they understand really clearly that these pictures, these videos on Twitter, on Telegram, on TikTok, they're not just videos, they're really evidence. And in many cases, they might be the only pieces of evidence that a cluster munition was dropped on a school or that a mass grave was discovered somewhere. Because you have to remember, not just in Ukraine, but in lots of places around the world, it might just be too dangerous to send out investigators physically, or they might only reach these areas years and years after the conflict has taken place. So the trend that we've seen, again, not just at international legal instances, but also at national courts, in particular in Germany, is that courts are increasingly recognizing how important digital investigations are to producing evidence that could be admissible in court. So we're quite hopeful that this project is going to inform legal processes in the future.
Actually, let's pick up on that. Can you give us that particular example in Germany where that data actually did work?
Yeah, so this was a case that took place in Germany relatively recently, and it had to do with the assassination of a dissident from Russia who was in Germany, and he was killed in a German park. And Bellingcat actually conducted an investigation that revealed his actual identity and his connections to the Russian state. And this evidence was used in court in the trial of this individual. He was arrested and charged with this murder. And part of the trial involved, again, these findings that Bellingcat investigators, my colleagues, made in this case. And so we know already in this particular case, in this one particular case, that a court has admitted digital evidence that's been processed through the methodology that we've helped to develop at Bellingcat, and has used it as admissible evidence in a trial.
It's still very clear, though, that the courts seem to be behind on this open source data. How close do you think we are in having international rules that lay out how we probably collect, archive, and present data from conflict zones for war crime prosecutions?
So I think we're maybe further along than we might think. There's a really great group of scholars who are based in the Human Rights Center at Berkeley, at UC Berkeley. They're led by scholars like Alexa Koenig, who are lawyers, international lawyers, and also who are people who've recognized the value of open source digital investigations. And so they put together something that's called the Berkeley Protocol. And this came out, I believe, in late 2019 or early 2020. And this is a protocol that lays out exactly every single step that you need to take as an investigative team to locating, archiving, analyzing, and then presenting evidence that you collect via these methods, precisely for the purposes of presenting it in court. So this is a really big project. This Berkeley Protocol was something that had a lot of stakeholders, a lot of people contributed to it. And I would say that this is definitely the first code book that exists out there to help somebody like a prosecutor set up a team of digital investigators to find evidence of, for example, potential war crimes, and then present them in court.
What I noticed is you don't call yourself a journalist, and I've read that you don't call yourself a journalist, but I want to ask you, do you consider yourself a citizen journalist at all?
I would say probably closer to citizen journalist than a journalist. I'm sort of hung up on that idea, and I do talk a lot about it a lot because I don't have any formal training in journalism. I didn't really set out to become a journalist. I'm fully cognizant of the fact that a lot of the work that I do is journalistic. I conduct an investigation, I ask questions, I answer them, and I present them on a website that people click on and read, right? So that's totally journalism. But I think what makes Bellingcat interesting is that we don't just do that. We also do all kinds of other activities that aren't really journalistic. We do a lot of training for other folks, like journalists, for example, on how to do this kind of work. We do a lot of community engagement. We're really involved in teaching people how to do this so that they can learn how to do it themselves. And so I suppose as a kind of a citizen journalist who's really passionate about this methodology and about the fact that anyone can do this if they sit down and try to learn it. Yeah, that's what I see myself as, more than like let's say a traditional journalist.
I think it's fair to say that you and your organization is filling some gaps. Journalism outlets just simply can't afford to keep foreign bureaus open. They increasingly don't have boots on the ground journalists many countries away in terms of reporting. Do you feel like you're filling that gap?
I think that we're definitely doing something that complements like boots on the ground journalism. And for the reasons that you've outlined, like sometimes it's just prohibitively expensive if you have a newsroom to send people out, or as I mentioned earlier, maybe it's too dangerous to send people out, or you just have no access to an area. So when Bellingcat started in 2014, we were probably the first people who were doing this sort of in an organized, kind of serious way. But since then, lots of newsrooms have said, hey, the work that Bellingcat is doing is fantastic. We want to be able to do that kind of thing ourselves as well. And so, for example, now you have the New York Times Visual Investigations team, which is fantastic, and they do incredible work. The Washington Post has a visual forensics unit, which works with digital open source information. CNN also has a digital investigations unit. And I think that increasingly over time, that's going to be the trend, that more and more newsrooms are going to recognize this is a really viable avenue to make important discoveries about what's happening in the world. And they're going to want to invest in setting up these units like the New York Times have done, like CNN has done, like the Washington Post has done.
In terms of traditional media, this is sort of a barrier and obstacle that journalists have been facing. Only 15% of Canadians surveyed in an Ipsos poll last year said that they had a great deal of trust and confidence in traditional media. You're not traditional media, and you say you're not even media. You are part of a team of regular people. Is there a chance that the public could wind up trusting you more than journalists?
I'd love to see a survey that does a comparative study of, who do you trust more? Is it the New York Times or Bellingcat? I'd be really curious to see what the results are. But I will say that there's something special about the way that Bellingcat engages, again, with information that anybody can find, even the reader, especially the reader, and also in the way that we present our findings. So not only is our data open, so again, anybody can click on the links and see for themselves, oh yes, I see that that's the picture that you're working with, for example, but also when we present the results of an investigation, we don't just tell you, we did an investigation, here's what we found. We very meticulously take the reader step by step through every single link, every single picture, every single bit of analysis that we conducted. So by the end of the article, hopefully the reader doesn't have to trust us because they see for themselves, okay, you've done all your math, I've followed every single step, and I agree with the conclusion. So I think that's something that's maybe a little bit special to Bellingcat, and I hope that that leads to an increased sense of trust from the readership that we have.
I got to say that you probably have tons of friends on your side in terms of the work you do, but you also have tons of enemies. And I want to mention friends. One former CIA deputy chief said that they loved Bellingcat for the work that you do. You've also, and your organization has been accused online for working for the CIA, that you choose investigations that are that have a very Western slant to them. What's your response to those people?
Let me just say, we're not friends with the CIA or with that particular person. I know the quote that you're mentioning, and it's we were nervous when we saw that because we don't have any contact with them, and it caught us off guard that they would say that about us. I would say that there is sort of an institutional momentum inside Bellingcat to do research on Russia. So that's one thing. Again, the very first big investigation that Bellingcat worked on involved the Russian government sending a missile launcher to Ukraine and then resulting in the killing of a plane load full of people. So starting from that, there's a sort of an institutional momentum that's built so that we're looking at Russia, we're continuing to look at Russia really just based on that first investigation. There's something also particular to Russia that makes it more prone to this kind of analysis. The Russian civil service is really leaky. And so if you are a Russian citizen, chances are all of your personal information is on the internet because it's been leaked over the years by civil servants who are looking to make extra money. And that goes even for spies. And so that's something that's unique to Russia, and something that again makes it particularly, I wouldn't say easy, but it makes it more prone to be the kind of place where you can do research on, for example, spies, and find out lots of details about them in a way that you can't really do with the United States or with Canada or with other Western countries.
I do have to ask, has the Russian state ever tried to retaliate?
So we have had a number of cyber attacks conducted against us. They're called spear phishing attacks. So this is when you get an email in your inbox and it looks like it's an email from Google or like from your bank, and you can't tell the difference. You can't tell that it's actually a fake email. And so the idea with these emails is that they say, hey, Giancarlo, this is Google. Your account has been compromised. Click on this link and we'll help you fix it. And when I click on the link, the attacker will get access to my data. So we have been subjected to those kinds of attacks. We have a relationship with the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. They're a fantastic group of people out there. And whenever we get one of those weird looking emails, we'll send it to them, and then they'll take a look at it, and then they'll tell us, yeah, this looks like it might be from the Russian government. So that's happened a couple of times. Not just the Citizen Lab, but we have other organizations that are in cybersecurity that help us make these determinations. So we can't be 100% sure, but from what these experts have told us over the years, there have been a couple of incidents where it looked like entities connected to the Russian government were trying to essentially hack our emails to get into all of our data.
We have a few seconds left, but I do have to ask, because I feel like there are going to be people who are listening or watching to this interview and be like, how do I get involved? If I'm unable to get to, say, the front lines of this war in Ukraine, if I want to be able to volunteer with Bellingcat or do something, what's sort of the process?
So we have a volunteer program. It's called the Global Authentication Project. And right now we are training people on how to do what I just told you that we were doing, finding images, archiving them, verifying them coming from Ukraine. So if you just email volunteer@bellingcat.com, you'll be put in touch with our volunteer coordinator. There's a waiting list, unfortunately. Well, fortunately, because it shows that lots of people are interested in helping out. But at some point, we'd love to be able to get back to you and onboard you so that you can help us do this kind of work and also work on other projects.
Giancarlo, thank you so much. Really great stuff. And again, thanks for joining us on the program tonight.
Thank you so much.
According to new calculations from the advocacy organization, the Ontario Living Wage Network, minimum wage just isn't cutting it for people in many communities. Justin Chandler covers Hamilton Niagara for Ontario Hubs, and he joins us now to explain. Hello, Justin.
Hey there.
All right, so the Ontario Living Wage Network has been around since 2017, but I don't think a lot of people know what a living wage is when you compare it to a minimum wage. Break it down for us.
So a minimum wage, this is the rate, that's the minimum amount that an employer is allowed to pay you for an hour of work. This is set by the province. In Ontario, since October, that's $15.50. So a living wage is born from the idea that earning minimum wage is not enough to really thrive in a community, to fully participate. And so it's a calculation that this group does to try and show the amount that you need, not just to get by, but to be part of a community. So to be able to, go out to eat once in a while, or go out and use the bus. There's a small entertainment budget. So it's trying to set a rate that people would need to earn working full time in order to, just have a little bit more than just scrape and buy on minimum wage, which is unfortunately what people have to do if they're earning that rate.
All right, let's get a little granular here. How exactly is a living wage determined?
So the way that the Living Wage Network has calculated this since 2021 is they take three representative situations, or let's call them representative households. So there's a single adult, there's a family of 2 adults and 2 young children, and then there's a single parent. And so they look at these situations, they look at the amount of government support they might be getting, and they look at, based on the community that they live in, how much they would need to buy a basket of goods. And so this includes, food, housing, transportation, internet, so some things like that. And then what they do is they weight that average based on the amount of that types of families, and they look at, for each region, what the living wage would be. And so they do this actually all over the province, and there's several different rates depending on where you live.
Now, this year's calculations were a little bit different. Also, not just the numbers themselves and how they calculate it, but also the geography. Can you break this down a little bit for us?
They used to do something like 50 different communities based more on political boundaries, and the Living Wage Network was not able to update these every year. So now what they've done is they've moved to Statistics Canada sort of economic groupings. So they're actually looking at the entire province now, and they've grouped many different communities together more geographically. So we're looking now, for the most part, at bigger areas than we were before, but this means that they're able to update it more regularly and they're able to capture the entire province.
Well, let's have a look at those updated numbers. Here's a graph, Justin, and I'm hoping you can sort of take us through some of the numbers and what they reflect.
Yeah, so this is some of the communities that they're doing. So the Greater Toronto Area, what we're seeing there is the living wage rates, the amount that you need to be earning is $23.15. For Hamilton, it's $19.05. For Brant, Niagara, Haldimand, Norfolk, it's $19.80. So for these ones, we're looking at, housing costs have gone up a ton as Toronto's become more expensive. That's really rippled through Hamilton, that's rippled through Niagara and just the areas surrounding. The costs have sort of gone up south and then moved through the peninsula. So we're really seeing costs increase there. In Hamilton, you can see the current rate is $19.05. Last year, it was $17.20. So you can really see this is a community where the living wage has gone up quite a bit. Inflation's driven up all sorts of costs. We've also seen a significant increase in Hamilton in the price of housing. I know since I moved to Hamilton a couple of years ago, asking rents for two-bedroom apartments, for example, has gone up over 20%. So people are really feeling the cost of housing. That's a big problem throughout the GTA and the Hamilton Niagara area. The whole Golden Horseshoe has seen the cost of housing radiate outwards from Toronto as prices have gone up there. For Ottawa, we're at $19.60. For Eastern Ontario, $19.05. For Northern Ontario, $19.70. Northern Ontario is particularly interesting as well. Sault Ste. Marie saw the biggest increase of all the communities that they've got listed. It actually went from $16.20 to $19.70. So now it's part of this northern group, and the rate's gone up. But in the north, we're seeing a lot of things are particularly expensive. Transportation costs, notably much more so than the south. Same with communications, food costs. And for the southwest there, we're seeing $18.15. The lowest rate in the province is actually, I think, $18.05, which is in London, Elgin, Oxford.
Now, Justin, I want to talk about employers. There's a little bit of, we'll call it bragging rights, but the Ontario Living Wage Network certifies employers who pay their employees a living wage. Do we have an idea of how many employers actually are taking part in this initiative?
So they certify about 500 employers, but there could also be employers who are paying this rate who aren't in touch with the Living Wage Network and so therefore haven't gotten this certification. The network uses some funding from, I think, credit unions and from members in order to run. So it's possible there's just people who aren't participating, but who are in fact paying that.
All right, I know you spoke to a number of people for your article on TVO.org, and I'm curious, what did they say about what it would take for this idea to be more universal?
Yeah, there's a number of things here whenever it comes to trying to push for wages. But one of the biggest things, at least locally, that we've seen in Hamilton is advocacy around cities. So trying to get the city to pay a living wage, which is something that advocates have been successful with to a certain degree. So it used to be that not all employees in the city were at the living wage. In recent years, they have been. However, so far advocates have been unsuccessful in getting the city to pay summer students a living wage. So that's currently a push right now. And then the goal is to get them to pay subcontractors a living wage as well. So there are municipalities that do this. The regional municipality of Waterloo is a recent example where they're paying all employees, students, and subcontractors that living wage. And the idea is that when you've got this big public employer and it's the city, that there's maybe some cachet to saying, this is more of a living wage community now, or the city's going to do this, so we hope that other businesses will do the same. There's also a lot of advocacy just generally in trying to get employers to do this. And the pitch is sort of, people need this. People need to be able to participate in the community, but that it's also good for the community overall. If people aren't just scraping by and they can actually afford to, spend some money that they're earning, that goes back into the economy. and that helps out everybody. That's the pitch.
Justin, thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight.
You take care.
The agenda this week examined the causes of rising food costs, learned about the growing influence of global management consultancies, and asked what more money in education would deliver. The agenda's week in review begins debating whether strong mayor powers are a threat to democracy.
Why would he want this? Why would he put a target on his own back by asking for these extraordinary powers that no other, as Josh says, legislature in the world has?
I'm not going to speak to why John accepted this and why he advocated for it, if in fact he did. I don't know. Those aren't conversations I've had with him about this matter. What I do think is that it leads to lazy decision-making.
Meaning what?
Meaning that, the Ford government just, they've just decided the Greenbelt's now open for development without actually thinking through what that might mean. Now we actually have a home builders association that thinks the mayor can expedite permits, which they can't. It has people believe that we're going to actually have rooming houses approved, but they're not. And so all of it creates and feeds into a level of cynicism, which I think is really bad for the republic, body republic, as it were. And I think it's bad for decision makers and is bad for every level of government authority. What really is, from my perspective, the most damaging is the fact that we do have a housing crisis. And so while we're having this little discussion about what's going on here, we're not actually fixing the real issue, which is how do we afford to embrace 6 million people in Ontario over the next
It's not a small thing.
It's not a small thing.
And
because it's not just housing. Sorry, but it's not just housing, it's transportation, it's school. Why do you want to build an entire new city within a city and not 1 ounce of money goes to education?
And we need school capacity, we need childcare, we need parks, infrastructure, which we have a dearth of.
You need to be able to flush your toilet.
And once again, housing is the last list on the priority when we're talking about these things, right?
So
can we agree on one thing, though, just to Karen's point, though, on rooming houses? The irony is, I think I heard a stat that John Tory, even with his meager, relatively strong mayor powers that he has today, has been successful in roughly 96% of the votes. So the rooming houses vote may be the one kind of consequential one that he said he didn't have the ability to get through. The reality is, with the new election being over, we have the majority of votes to move forward with rooming houses. He's not lost on the 30 other housing-related items at council. So it also begs the question that you posed to Karen, which of course none of us really know the answer to. Why would he request these undemocratic powers? And I don't know if anyone can answer that other than John Tory. But frankly, I think the city is moving faster and further with enhanced housing opportunities in neighborhoods than the provincial government is doing in Bill 23. The city is moving forward with not enough, not good enough, but frankly far more than the province has on substantive housing-related priorities.
Luca, maybe you could help us with this, because the conventional wisdom today is that the Mayor of Toronto asked the Premier of Ontario for these powers, and the Premier of Ontario, even though he didn't campaign on it, granted him this authority. Do you know that to be, in fact, the case?
I can't speak to that. I'm not privy to conversations that the mayor would have with the premier. I do know that within the provincial government, prior to the election, there was a sentiment that a lot of priority housing initiatives may have moved through municipalities at a rate that was slower than desired, which could have contributed to a supply issue within the province. And there was a serious amount of discussion, around how can we make these processes quicker.
Okay, can I ask you a real smart-ass question as a follow-up now?
Absolutely.
Okay, you used to work for Steve Clark.
I did.
Municipal Affairs and Housing Minister.
Yes.
The once and still. Okay, he used to be a mayor.
He was.
Can you imagine when he was a mayor whether he would have thought this was kosher?
I can't speak to that either. Because discussions on strong mayor powers, to be completely honest, happened after my tenure in his office.
Do you think he's totally on side with all of this?
I think the provincial government is looking for ways to work with municipalities to move processes when it comes to home building.
That's not what I asked. Do you think he's totally on side with all of this?
The
They're
shortened
handing the
process that are
hot
pertaining to
potato
hot-
back to the municipalities. That's what
So
they're doing.
I can't speak to the political sentiment around the strong mayor powers within the government because, again, that happened at a time after I was the chief of staff. But I will say that the government has been focused on trying to find ways to shorten those processes that are related to building homes in this province.
isn't the way.
Because there is a supply crisis in this country, or in this province. We have to build 150,000 homes year over year for the next 10 years.
It won't happen.
And
It
to put it in
won't happen. It's
not gonna
perspective,
happen.
to put it in perspective, the best housing start we had on record was in the year 2020, I believe, and we built 100,000 homes. So we have to increase that efficiency by 50% consistently over the next 10 years. So it doesn't surprise me that the province is looking at, let's call it pretty significant measures through Bill 3, through Bill 23, and through Bill 39 to move these processes along more quickly. Because the convention, at least at Queen's Park, is that there is some sort of tension or delay in the system, and that is happening at the municipal level. Now, I can appreciate that there is there is more to that argument, and there's a lot of municipalities coming out and saying, well, there are people sitting on approved lots, the market is fluctuating, supply chain, et cetera, but a lot of what the government has done through Bill 108, More Homes, More Choice, Bill 109, and Bill 23 has been focused on getting these municipal processes more streamlined and more efficient.
I get it, but you're hearing considerable pushback on the table here, on her radio show, in the broader public, that this isn't the way to do it.
Exactly.
If this was the aim, is there a better way? Let me ask you, is there a better way for it to have been done?
I think there is a better way for it to be done. I mean, I think, first of all, the province is ignoring its own housing affordability task force major recommendations, in which, increasing density in existing neighborhoods was the major theme of that report. 4 stories and 4 units by right. And, I do think that we suffer.
That was dead on arrival, though, Eric. That was dead on arrival. His former boss said there's no support for that right now.
Yeah, and so he's talking about how bold, he's being on housing and, standing up to the NIMBYs, in which case, the policy, the number one policy that was recommended, too bold. So, is Steve Clark now the big banana? I don't know. But I think what we're suffering from in this province, and particularly at the municipal level, is a shortage of imagination. Because when it even comes to these changes, for example, to development charges that are reducing budgets, well, the goal here really should be about, okay, well, you can increase the amount of development charges you collect by making sure more housing gets built. And you can reduce the amount of infrastructure investments that you need to make by ensuring that that housing is directed to places where ample infrastructure already exists. And if you look at Toronto, or if you look at Mississauga, more than half of neighborhoods are losing population. We have schools throughout the city that are at risk of closure because not enough children live near them to go to. So we have this huge misallocation of public resources and this huge lack of imagination about how we can get people participating to build housing.
Sheila, your take on greedflation.
I think I agree with DT that absolutely these companies are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and they are maximizing their profits. I think I disagree with Ian because we have seen through the pandemic that margins, both in food manufacturers and in retailers, from the StatsCan data that was released last week, are just about double where they were in 2019 and are above the sort of 10-year average before that. So absolutely doing what they're supposed to be doing, increasing their margins. It shifts a bit between the manufacturers and the retailers because this is a very rapidly changing market, and absolutely the benefits of this are shifting between the two of them. I would say that from what we can tell from the agricultural returns, not so much. But that data is really aggregated, so harder to tell.
Ian, you haven't made the sale yet. You want to go again?
Sure. I think where the confusion, and I've been reading all the articles on this, is people are confusing the nominal data with the normalized data into percentages. I mean by that, the absolute dollars of profits are up, of course. The gross revenues in dollars are up because inflation. The cost of goods sold in gross dollars spent buying the stuff from the manufacturers is up, and the net profits in dollars is up. So people say, well, look, they're making more money, they've made more dollars in profits, therefore they're more profitable. But that's why we normalize data into percentages, and we compare, the unemployment rate percentage or the inflation rate percentage. The net profit margin, and that's a percentage, a ratio. I'm not talking dollars. I'm talking a percentage, is absolutely flatline in Canada for grocery retailing, and that data is straight from Stats Canada.
Okay, Sheila's got her eyes wide. Oh, you should have seen her eyebrows perk up when you said that. Okay, Sheila, you're on again.
So I am talking margins. I absolutely agree with you that, because during the pandemic, more people ate at home, less people ate at restaurants, and profits were up at grocery stores. I am absolutely talking about margins, and I hold what I just said, which is margins are up. They're up from where they were in the fourth quarter of 2019, and they are up from the kind of 10 years before that as a normalizer, and this is the percent. Absolutely. Pre-tax, I'm talking about.
Do you share Ian's view that this is normally a lousy business to invest in if you're looking to make a killing?
Absolutely. I agree that, that refineries and oil companies and banks are the ones that are making out like bandits in this economy, right? And margins are much lower. However, these companies are still doubling their margins from where they were pre-pandemic. And I think that's a public policy issue because this is an essential. And this is an essential that low-income families and individuals spend more of their income on than high-income families. And that's why I think it's a public policy issue.
Sylvain, we haven't heard from you yet on greedflation. Go ahead.
I'm really enjoying this very educated conversation about greedflation, to be honest. We mustn't forget about the bread price fixing scandal that we actually had a few years ago, and I think this is about consumer trust. Completely agree with Sheila in terms of transparency, and this is really what the problem is, I think. But when you look at margins in particular, if you look at the entire supply chain, I don't think retail is the problem. But there are concerns around processing for certain verticals. Yeah. And I can actually venture to say that meat is one of them. I would also look at production as well. The Canadian Dairy Commission went ahead with an increase of 8.4% without providing any numbers to the Canadian public. The Canadian Dairy Commission is a Crown corporation, and I think that Canadians deserve some transparency from the Crown Corporation. We never got that, and now we're paying 20% more for butter and everything else at the dairy section. So I think right now, what's going on is that Canadians feel unprotected, and the Competition Bureau is not doing its job. The bread price fixing scheme investigation is still ongoing after 7 years. Nothing has been resolved.
DT, there's no question the bread price fixing scheme was not the finest hour for the industries that were involved in that. But we started this discussion by pointing out all of the different reasons why prices are going up right now. Do you think it's fair to say that consumers are getting ripped off by industry at the moment?
I mean, what do we mean by being ripped off? People are finding it more difficult to afford the things that they took for granted that they could afford. They go to the grocery store, and I don't know about you, but, I buy kind of habitually. I have the things that I buy, I buy, and now suddenly I have the sticker shock. And so people are having to confront, what can I afford, what can I not afford?
But that's not necessarily because of corruption.
No,
I
do not think that this is corruption. I think that this is honestly capitalism working the way capitalism is supposed to work. Now it's opening some questions about why does it work that way? Does it working that way benefit all of us? And if it's not benefiting all of us, what needs to be done? So I actually like the big questions that are being opened up about this. Where does profit actually come from? Where do the grocery chains actually make their profit? Is this earned and deserved? If it's not, what should be done about it?
These firms, Amanda, are now kind of being referred to as a kind of shadow public service. Has it become difficult to tell the difference between who's actually a public servant on Parliament Hill and who's a management consultant?
Yes, it really can be. And I think this is part of a larger trend of hollowing out the state. We haven't been significantly investing in the capacities of our public servants for decades, and this is across Liberal and Conservative governments. And so if you find yourself in a position where you haven't been hiring in modern skills or also taking a good hard look at how the federal public service is managed and revising things like HR practices and streamlining some of the red tape that can bog public servants down and make it difficult for them to be innovative and creative, then you get to a position where your default is to turn to these outside players. I think where we should be really concerned is that, as you noted, in some cases, it's not clear who's a public servant and who is a management consultant. They're being hired in and embedded within the public service. They have government email addresses. They have security clearances. In one case, a public servant told me that they actually couldn't access a government building and someone from McKinsey swiped them in. I think that kind of beautifully captures what is going on in many of these cases. And where we need to be worried is that public servants should absolutely be leaning on outsiders for expertise and injecting a pluralistic sort of a range of ideas into the policy process. We don't need to pretend that government has a monopoly on good ideas. But if you don't have a core of expertise in-house and you're really hamstrung by unhelpful internal rules and accountability measures, then you can't hold these people to account. And you often are, I think, outsourcing not just delivery, but strategy and design and really core questions that should probably be left and should be managed by public servants who have an accountability to the minister.
Well, Michael, let me get you to weigh in on that, because I presume, now maybe this is hopelessly naive, but I would presume that governments wouldn't bring on outside consulting firms to do work that their own bureaucrats could do unless they felt that the talent outside was better than it was inside. Fair to say?
Mm-hmm. It's entirely possible. A lot of times, the ministers that will come in, have buddies that works at some of these consulting companies, and they bring them in. And this is not just a Canadian problem. This is a global problem. Certainly south of the border here in the United States, these consulting firms are everywhere in state and federal governments and local governments. Germany, has had a big issue with this, especially in the Defense Department there, or the Defense Ministry. France right now is absolutely agog over a McKinsey scandal over these same issues, this concern that, this creeping influence of consultants in government. Saudi Arabia, also similar, South Africa. So it really is a global issue.
Jamin, I presume you interact both with politicians and with civil servants. Do you think cabinet ministers are at the point now where they actually trust you more than their own bureaucrats to get the best advice?
Well, I think it depends on the cabinet minister and their disposition to the civil service.
Give me an example then.
Well, I think that we see conservative governments are less frequent across Canada, both federally and provincially. And so after a long, period of governance by another party, you come into power, you want an agenda, you're voted in on an agenda that ostensibly is different than what's been done for a long time. And civil service is set up to move slowly, to manage risk, and ultimately to see the sort of downsides of all the options that are on the table. So, if you're elected in with an agenda of change, you've got a civil service that rightfully is there to, find the flaws in the things that you want to do and to resist moving quickly on things that might introduce risk into the system or might not clearly understand all the issues that civil servants are working with and facing every day. And so,
another obnoxious follow-up here then. Is it also fair to say that some politicians bring on these consulting firms because these consulting firms have given them campaign donations or their buddies from way back, and therefore they want to float some business their way?
I think that to Michael's point, there's always a sort of relationship aspect to any consulting business. I'm sure that plays a role in some instances in governments across the world. I think Canada has a pretty good system in place to avoid the types of conflicts of interest that might introduce that. Certainly a lot of the things that are pointed to in terms of the relationship between McKinsey, let's say, and state governments and working on both sides of both the regulators and the regulated are not things that I think Canada's system really allows for. There's pretty strict controls on that.
Let's say, in a magical world, the government decided it was going to spend twice as much money on education tomorrow as they're spending today. Would our system necessarily be twice as good?
No. There. We're done. No, I think that, I think it's been and I've been doing this for a very long time now, so one of the problems, I think, for the last 25 years has been so much of the conversation's been about money and not about purpose, what we're doing, why we're doing it, what we need to change or kind of reimagine going forward. And I think we even forget that there are kind of two fundamental roles for public education, one for the individuals in it, but one for all of us as a society. And that's what we have to talk about first, way before we talk about money.
All right. Having said that, Mark, we spend $32 billion a year on education in the province of Ontario. If tomorrow we made it $64 billion, in your view, would we be twice as good?
I'm with Annie on this. I think that we need to be more strategic around how we invest, and we need to prioritize how we not only educate students, but also how we educate educators. I think when I think of the learning centers that TVO provides, I think that lifelong learning should be a part of everyone's learning journey. And when we think about educators in particular, those who are on the offensive in terms of preparing young people and their fertile minds for the future of work and really enabling the prosperity of this country, what we need to think about is how do we better prepare educators to ensure that youth are better prepared for the world of work.
Okay. Paul Bennett, if we went from $32 billion to $64 billion, would we be twice as good?
No, I think the answer would be that doubling spending is not the answer, because it begs the question, on what, over what period of time, and what are the priorities? And what we've learned, those of us that study education, is that if you pour money into the system, it doesn't necessarily end up going where it's going to do the most good. And I think you'd be surprised at how little would actually reach the classroom.
Aisha, are you going to make it unanimous, or are you going to go your own way here?
I have to say that I actually, on a more optimistic note, I think that if we spent twice as much money, there's an opportunity for our education system to be even more than twice as good. Like Annie was mentioning, I think it's about being really intentional about where we're spending that money. Obviously, I would say listening to students is a big part of that, and understanding that putting money into the issue might not address some of the deeper problems that exist, but at the same time, there are a lot of areas in our education system that would really benefit from additional funding, and with the right kind of strategy and consultation around it, I think we could even aim higher than twice as good.
All right. Well, you say we have to listen to students. That's one of the reasons we invited you here today, because we do want to do that. But of course, the question presupposes that if you got a system that would be twice as good if you spent twice as much, that means we're spending intelligently, smartly on everything that we're spending on today, which is clearly not the case. So let's break it down. Annie, what are we spending on today that we're spending intelligently on, and therefore we probably ought to be doing more of that going forward?
Well, the vast majority of money in education is spent on educators. It's spent on people, because that's what education is. It's a relationship between staff and students and each other. So that's where the money goes, and that's where it should go.
You mean salaries, basically?
It's spent on salaries, and that is right. But I think that it's thinking about policy first. So going, okay, where do we need more educators or more other different kinds of staff? Where do we need to rethink, maybe if we're talking about education kind of globally, the education of staff, or providing, do we have enough time for professional development or to rearrange schools? So the money is spent on staff. But I think that what we haven't done for a very, very, very long time is really look at it from a kind of wider perspective in terms of, it really, all the things, the cliches people say about education, sadly, are it does look the same as it's looked for 150 years. And the world is vastly, vastly different. And I think, to Aisha's point, when I work with the students' trustees a lot, if we listen to students more, really, and not in a tokenistic way, but actually had them at the center of these conversations, we would be thinking about where do we need to expand programs, where do we need to shift how we're allocating staff, or where we need more, how are we ensuring that we have, kind of equitable outcomes in our schools, which we still don't. We still talk about moving the equity needle, and it hasn't really moved. So it's looking at those deep things, but also, in Mark's work, looking at the future and going, and it's not that, and looking at what we mean by skills gaps, because we should be preparing kids for life in all sorts of ways, and we're not doing that as well as we could be.
Let me pursue that last angle there with Mark, and that is that we are spending a great deal of money every year on education in Ontario. We seem to be spending it, apropos of what Annie said, on a model that's 150 years old. How should we better be, or more smartly be, spending that money so it's more future-looking as opposed to putting it down a hole that's been there for 155 years already?
Great question. All the data tells us that Canada's educational institutions are among the best in the world. And that is true. But it is interesting then that data also tells us that we are falling behind our G7 partners in terms of economic output, economic growth, and so on. So it begs the question, why is that happening? Well, one of the reasons that is happening is because we have not reimagined our education system for 100 years. Globally, we need to be focusing on a skills economy. We need to be focusing on skills mobility, making sure that young people understand where the opportunities for the future are, and ensuring that educators also know where those opportunities for the future are. We talk, for example, about professional development days for teachers. One idea that we've been talking about for the longest while is around how can we create co-op placements for educators. So 1 or 2 of those professional development days, an educator gets to spend time in the world of work, outside of the school setting.
That's just some of what we've covered this week. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, TVO.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's it for this Friday, December 2nd, 2022. Monday, can increasing immigration levels cure what ails Canada's labour market? We'll explore that. I'm Jane Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, and Steve, we'll see you on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.